Indie horror is a field I'm very passionate about. Two of my favorite games, Omori and Doki Doki Literature Club, are part of this subgenre. I believe in the profound and often inspiring stories that they can tell, free from the shackles of corporate expectation and through the genre of horror, something I believe to be an optimal vehicle for some great storytelling. I love indie horror. But sometimes, and increasingly so, there is a problem in the stories. We can probably blame one game in particular for this: Five Nights at Freddy's. Now, for some quick background, I love FNAF, and I do believe in the story it's trying to tell. And yet, I don't think it has an inherently interesting story, at least in the conventional sense. Honestly, ask yourself, for a story about the murder of a particular demographic, do you feel that emotional baggage, that weight? If you're anything like me, you probably don't. And yet, even so, I'm invested. I'm confused by this dichotomy. I've watched pretty much every game theory episode on the subject about 10 times, some of them more, so why is this? Well, my friends, what I'll attempt to uncover today is why I don't find the actual story to be interesting, and then answer the subsequent question of why we're all still invested. So, are you ready? Because if so, I think it's time I sell my soul as a YouTuber and finally talk about Five Nights at Freddy's. It's kind of funny, because the more I'm thinking about it, the more I realize that the thing that makes a story unengaging is what also makes it engaging: the delivery. FNAF doesn't really have the most original story. It has eventually become a sci-fi story about the immortality of a serial killer, and while it focuses more on that first part than a lot of other stories, the concept is far from new. Look at any semi-popular and enduring slasher, and you'll realize the slogan "I always come back" might as well be a "see you next time." Seriously, they all always come back. There's no way to kill these people. I do think there are some interesting plot beats within the story, but it still just isn't very original. More so than its copycats, but still. If it wasn't FNAF, I wouldn't care about it in the slightest. And that's interesting, such a concept. But let's save why to the second part of this video. Originality and concept doesn't really matter, however, as I discussed in my The Detective Is Already Dead video. One that nobody watched and, funnily enough, died itself after about a week of being pushed out. What's important then is execution. We need to be able to feel the weight of the emotions that the story is trying to convey. And that's the first roadblock. The story doesn't really convey any. There are a lot of ways to tell a story, and one of them is through mystery. It can be a great device to entice the person experiencing said story, but it can be taken too far. Five Nights at Freddy's uses the model of what I like to call the lore model. I just said model twice there despite having a bachelor's in English, so go me. This is where the story is told through, well, lore. The advantages of this will be in the next section, but the disadvantages of this are plentiful, but it mostly comes down to one flaw. The story is often disjointed and therefore lacks emotion. We're not even going to get into how convoluted the story of FNAF is, that's all for MatPat to figure out, but even in the first 2 games when things were seemingly simpler, I wouldn't say they were any less disjointed. Using the lore model means you are asking your fanbase to actively and at times challengingly seek out the story, making it more of, well, a game than a cohesive narrative. We like to see the pieces being put together, so much so that when they are, a lot of us don't care how interesting the whole actually is. This model works well for indie games which desperately need exposure. YouTube has become such a vital part to the lifeblood of indie horror, specifically because they need to incite conversation to entice people not even really to play the game personally, but to join the franchise's fan base. This model isn't exactly perfect for making people actually buy games when all they care about, like myself, is the lore, all of which is going to be told through YouTube video instead of the actual game. This is where merchandise is invaluable. Therefore, the lore model is understandable, but it still doesn't make for a very interesting story. Because there are so many scattered pieces, all of which need to fit both into the wider puzzle, but also fit into the mold of mysterious, seemingly unrelated event that won't fit well into a timeline, it once again comes across as incredibly disjointed. And that model of storytelling, which, interesting in the search, isn't really conducive to a cohesive story. And the challenge with media that is incohesive, as I learned through my own experience making my horror short film Squid Boy, is to be able to convey emotions, really much at all. It doesn't help that the gameplay is also often disconnected from the lore in these kinds of games, making for a rather hollow experience. So, because of the lore model, both the story and its inherent concept lack emotional weight, because of a disjointed delivery, and I'd also argue lack any real scary elements in terms of the story. Are we all wrapped up here? Not quite, actually, because I find it interesting that the story of Five Nights at Freddy's and all of my complaints in this video are fixed by the VHS fan-made tapes. Ask yourself, when it comes to the core concept of murder that is central to FNAF, forget atmosphere, jump scares, or tension, all of which are important, but not for the sake of this example of thought experiment. Which is scarier? The story of the games or the story of the VHS tapes? I think I know your answer, and it's probably the same as mine, the VHS tapes. And I think it's because they ignore the lore model and are able to just tell their stories, and in doing so offer the proper emotional weight that the concept should exude. This is also why the final night of the sixth game, Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, is so beloved by fans, since the actual story of the games takes center stage. We feel a huge rush of all the suppressed emotions all at once when we finally have an actual character introduced and monologuing, Henry. This is why everyone loves and thinks the ending to FNAF 6 is such a high point of the series, many calling it the best ending in the series and even the best moment in the entire franchise. This is also one of the high points of Security Breach, and while many criticize it for being a massive departure from the classic FNAF formula, others praise it for its characters. And some even its story, even though it's kind of a convoluted mess. The common argument is now that we know the characters, i.e. the animatronics, it's inherently less scary, but I would counter-argue that they just weren't made to be scary to an older audience, and that well-established characters will serve us to get more invested in the story, and thus find it scarier or at least more disturbing. We don't want to see bad things happen to characters we are actually invested in. That is one of the golden rules of the horror genre. People love mystery. That has been true since pretty much the dawn of man. People are usually scared of mystery. This has been true for probably even longer. And this, my friends, is why people care about the Five Nights at Freddy's, the FNAF storyline, so much. Because it is mystery itself, boiled down to its essential elements. I mean, think of it. How people are so incredibly invested in finding out the names of characters in this franchise. Like when we found out Cassidy, or the enduring mystery of the crying child. It's kind of unprecedented in a way, because why should we care about someone's name? It's so random. Like, yeah, cool, they have a name. Everyone does. We don't normally pay attention to that part of media, even when the name actually means something wider subtextually. And yet, with FNAF, even I myself am incredibly invested in that mystery. Because of that mystery. I've basically been spoiling this entire section off video, talking about things like how the lore model helps promote the video on YouTube, and all that great stuff. I honestly don't have anything else to say on the topic, so instead of wasting your time, let's just go to the end card. Welcome to the end card, or the end of the video. As always, I hope you're doing splendid. I myself am doing absolutely horrible, but that's not exactly a new thing. Time to announce my next big project. I will be working on a video entitled something like You Were Just a Video Game Character parentheses DDLC, where I use the lens of Doki Doki Literature Club to analyze how, well, you're probably not that different from a video game character. At least not as much as you and the rest of us would like to think. I hope you look forward to it. The video is going to be a daunting task to say the least. And, as always, thank you for watching.